Hey, kia ora, it's the grizzled old RJ Walrus here, talking about RJ. I want to talk about relapse, because more and more people are getting into recovery, and when they experience slips, it can be very distressing. You know, people get very upset about this. So I want to kind of give some words of advice, and also put it into context, so you can understand a little bit more about the processes that go on. So some of this is kind of stuff that's come up specific to RJ, and some of this comes from relapse prevention theory. That's age-old wisdom that comes from the addiction recovery community. So, okay, relapse. So the thing about an RJ relapse is there are two ways that I think an RJ relapse creeps in or can creep in. Okay, now tell me if you think I'm wrong here, because this is something that I'm probably basing it a bit on kind of personal experience rather than any kind of, like I said, there is no research into this field, but from hearing other people's experiences, because people don't often talk about the details of relapse. So I think relapse kind of happens in one of two ways. One is a trigger, an external trigger. Something comes up, that you can't necessarily do anything about. Somebody says something, something comes on the telly. It can be a minor trigger, it can be a major trigger, it can be a direct trigger or an indirect trigger, and I think that there are different kinds with RJ. So they can be very kind of indirect. So like I said in the past, I think an RJ trigger can be something like a bed shop. Because it makes you think of beds, it makes you think of people sharing beds, it makes you think of who your partner shared beds with, but it's not a very direct thing. Whereas a more direct thing might be that the name of an ex gets mentioned. It might be that you're with your partner and they bump into a friend and they talk about the ex. That could be a very direct trigger. But they're both kind of external, both two forms, indirect and direct, two forms of external trigger. So the other way that, and this is based on personal experience really from my own recovery, that an RJ trigger kind of comes from within, and whereas a trigger is more of a shout, the internal relapse mechanism is more of a whisper, and it's really interesting and it's really tricksy. Okay, because what happens is, we as RJ sufferers, we have a tendency to ruminate, okay, which means to think in cycles, to think in circles, to think and think and think, not necessarily in a linear way, but in a way that just goes round and round and round and round. So what tends to happen is that some of the RJ thoughts that we used to get, they still occur. I always see my video on what recovery looks like, because I would say that the thoughts still occur, it's just that they don't have any power, and that's a great thing, but it's also the danger, because what can happen is that the thoughts can kind of creep in, and instead of doing what you've learned to do, what you've hopefully learned to do, if I've had any part in or any influence in your recovery, I'd like to hope that you've been using the antidote technique or something very similar. Okay, which is a way of interrupting the thought patterns without trying to block the thought patterns or unthink the thought patterns. And what happens is, because as we get into recovery and we get better, the thoughts can still come in, but the intensity and the distress isn't there. We can find ourselves thinking things about our partner's past in a way that feels quite safe. In a way that doesn't feel like it doesn't feel distressing, it doesn't ring any internal alarm bells. So rather than interrupting that cycle and using the antidote technique, we don't do that anymore. We start to ruminate, and we start to think about things that we previously stopped ourselves thinking about. Okay, and that is deadly. We get it's almost like the mind, the RJ part of the mind, is lulling us into a false sense of security. So we start thinking about RJ type thoughts without the distress, so therefore we think it's safe to kind of follow up those thoughts with another thought and another thought, and to contemplate and to ruminate. And that's fine in the first instance, but once we've allowed ourselves to do that, we'll allow ourselves to do it again, and we'll allow ourselves to do it again, and we'll allow ourselves to do it again, and sooner or later that will result in a relapse. Now, relapse is a big, heavy, scary word that really frightens people. Okay, so first of all, I would say relapses are normal. Okay, so you will get relapses in recovery. You get into recovery, you'll feel a lot better, and then you'll get slips. I prefer to say slips really than relapses. And also I'm going to break the word relapse down into smaller parts, okay? So what I like to talk about is, and this comes from, again, drug and alcohol, addiction recovery. So what you have is a prelapse, not a prolapse, although that could be unfortunate if you do have a prolapse. A prelapse, a lapse, and a relapse, okay? So a lapse is an episode of retroactive jealousy after you've attained some degree of recovery. Okay. Now it's impossible to define how long an episode, but by the very nature of the term, an episode has an end. Okay. Total distraction here with my ADHD. There's a car going past them. They're playing Boney M. Daddy Cool. Boney M is my kind of guilty pleasure. I'm a secret Boney M fan, but don't tell him. Yes, this is one of the bad things about having ADHD. Right, what was I talking about? Where were you, Markie? You were talking about prelapse, lapse, and relapse. Not Boney M. Oh, I might do a video on Boney M one day. So, a lapse is an episode of returning to the distress and all the symptoms, the discomfort, the anxiety, the jealousy, and perhaps the behaviours, not necessarily, but perhaps the behaviours. And a relapse would be returning to it for some length of time and returning to all the behaviours and returning to regular patterns of that way of thinking. So you can see it's a grey area. When does a lapse become a relapse? It's very difficult to say, but I think there probably is some point where it does. But it'd be quite a difficult thing to actually identify that point. And then prior to that, you get prelapse. And prelapse is kind of what I'm talking about. Prelapse is normal. So you get prelapse, don't worry about it. It's to be expected. So prelapse is when you start getting those little thoughts that come into your head. The gentle, but in more gentle form, like I was talking about before. So you can think about the thoughts that used to really freak you out, but they don't seem to be having that impact. So it's normal that they should come back and be there, okay? That's perfectly normal, okay? Now, you don't have to lapse. Lapsing is quite normal. You do have to prelapse. Prelapse is kind of normal. You don't have to lapse, but you probably will a little bit in the early stages of recovery at least. And you don't have to, and if you do lapse, you don't have to allow that to become a relapse, a full-blown relapse. But you do have to act, okay, in each one of those cases. So prelapse is normal. We're not kind of expecting to get to a place where we're not in prelapse. Prelapse is normal. So what we need to do is remain vigilant and remain and keep using techniques so that when we get RJ type thoughts into our heads, we apply things like the antidote technique. If you don't know what the antidote technique is, check out my video called The Antidote Technique. There's 2 parts to it. It's a 2-parter. Now, that will, generally speaking, get you back on the straight and narrow. That will prevent the prelapse becoming a lapse. If a lapse does occur, and lapse is much more severe and comes with distress and comes with thinking, oh no, I'm back to where I was. You're not back to where you were, okay? All the work that you've done hasn't gone away. It's not wasted. You can, and people do go back to full-blown retroactive jealousy. But in a way, it's almost like a choice. If you choose to do nothing, if you choose not to put techniques into place to stop that, then that can happen. But if you put techniques in, it will stop it. So the sooner you employ strategies to interrupt the RJ thinking, the easier it is. So it's easier to do it after prelapse and before lapse. But it's still possible to do it after lapse and before relapse. But it's still possible to do it after relapse. Okay, and even so, the sooner you do that. So if you do it a day after relapse or a week after relapse, that's far better than if you do it a month or 2 months after relapse. So it's all okay. Don't panic. It's fine. If you get this sort of stuff, hang on, I'm just being interrupted by. It's Gwendoline bringing food.
Did you put that in the thing for me?
Look, I've just been given this to hold and not to eat. I've just got to look after this and not eat it. How am I supposed to do that? So, yes, to wrap up then, because the Kai's arrived. It's good news, really. None of these things are the end of the world. Take it for what it is. Use the strategies, get help, talk to people about it, do all the things that you used to do that worked before, and you're going to be okay. Okay, you will be okay. So I'm going to resist temptation. We're off to the beach for a bit of a picnic, and we'll see you soon. Thank you for watching. If you like this, please subscribe. Really helps us if you also sign up as a patron. That really supports our work. And give us a like, give us a nice comment, and we'll catch you soon. Rangimarie.